Kate, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you.
We're going to have a lovely chat about, sometimes these years come along and the anniversaries all line up.
I know.
And it happens to be one of those years for you because, as we can see behind you, Labyrinth, your best-selling novel, is 20 years old.
20.
And the Women's Prize, which you helped to found, is 30 years old.
Yes. Well, it's the 30th winner.
Okay.
So it always looks a bit weird. People go, hang on a second, is that the right number of years? And it's the 30th winner. So we founded it earlier than, of course, the first winner was announced.
We are happy to have something to celebrate.
Absolutely. We need to celebrate
be.
as much as we can, I think, at the moment.
We're going to start with Labyrinth, but actually we're going to start before Labyrinth because before you had ever written anything, you were working within publishing at Hodder and Stoughton, weren't you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I left university in 1984, and in those days, if you were a woman and whatever degree you had or whatever, and you had typing skills, you would be a secretary.
Right.
That's how it worked. I mean, it seems, now it's impossible for people because everybody types, everybody has computers, everybody has phones, and those kind of jobs have gone. But in my day, it was very straightforward. I had got proper secretarial training, so I signed up. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I left university, so I signed up for a temp agency, as they were called, and I was sent to a publishing company to be a temporary secretary, and it was Hodder and Stoughton in Bedford Square. And a couple of weeks later, somebody decided they weren't going to go back, or they were getting married. I can't remember what happened, and they said, "Oh, you're here. Do you want a job?" And I went, "Okay." So it was a random thing to start with, and I worked in publishing for 8-10 years.
And as I understand it, there came, I suppose, that fork in the road where you were offered a bigger position, but something in your mind, something in your head or your heart was talking to you about wanting to do something else, which was writing. And am I right in thinking that you were basically dared by somebody? Like, if you think that book...
Dared.
Yeah, doesn't exist, you have to write it.
Yeah, yes, all of those things are true. Quite often when I'm asked, at this great age now, to give advice to younger people, I say, well, there are two ways. There are the people who plan, and I was brought up by my parents to think if you're offered a chance, give it a go. If you fail, tant pis, do something else. And so I've lived my entire career, and people say, take me through your career. It was like, I'll try this, I'll try that. And so, there were two things happened at the same time. I was offered a big job. I'd gone back after having my first child, and that was great. I'd gone back and I was an editorial director in Random House, as it then was. And there were also, I was newly pregnant, just discovered I was pregnant, and it was the very first meeting of the Women's Prize. It wasn't called the Women's Prize, and it was a group of us, men and women, gathered together in January 1992 in a flat in North London. No one owns up to calling that meeting. Nobody quite knows how we all got to be there and all of these things. And I can remember very clearly, I was just pregnant, but I didn't even know it. But I went in, those days in publishing were very different from now. Walked into the flat and someone put a glass of wine in my hand, and I thought, oh no. That honestly was my first indication. I thought, and out of that meeting started to come the idea for a prize to celebrate and amplify and honour women's writing. And these things happened at the same time. And then I was offered this big job in publishing that would have involved quite a lot of travel. And I had to sit myself down and say, okay, is this, Kate, what you want? If you want to be the CEO of a publishing company, you take this job. And if you don't, you've got to be brave enough to step up now, because if you don't step out now, you won't. So it was like, oh, great timing. Sort of pregnant with the second child, let's turn down the job. And but I did.
Yeah.
And we went traveling for a few months, my husband and I and our 2-year-old, and a growing bump. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But the dare came in when I was sitting with an agent friend, and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know really. And I said, apart from anything else, I'm pregnant. And the book I really wanted to read when I was pregnant first time around still isn't around. It's incredibly annoying. And he said, why don't you stop moaning and write it? And my entire career has been challenges like, why don't you do this?
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I will. And the way I tell the story is better than him. He says that it was a couple of weeks later. He rang up and said, Virago would like to publish this book on pregnancy. I say it was the next day.
Okay.
That's a much better story. And I went, all right. So then I was suddenly newly pregnant, newly without a job. I was the main earner in our family, so it was significant for me to have turned that down, but we managed. And I started to write a book called Becoming a Mother, which is still in print all these years later. That baby that I was about to have is now, a 32-year-old man writing, about to have his first book published next year. Was an actor. The little 2-year-old is, runs the Paul Smith Foundation and has children of her own. And here I am still writing.
Well, then, of course, it's easy to look back and kind of go, that was the right decision. But at the time, a big decision, as you said.
Oh, it's huge.
And despite, I'm sure, all the advice that you might have got from people, does the decision still come from something far more guttural, I suppose, where you're just sort of thinking, this feels like the right thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Or rather, it feels like the right thing to do to not take that job.
Yeah.
If you like, it wasn't that I left to write. I didn't. These things all happened at the same time. But it was an emotional decision, absolutely, because we went from having, a proper salary, company car in those days, office, people, all of that kind of thing, to having an income of £5,000 between the two of us. And, my husband was an interpreter and a translator, but we decided when we were going to have a second child that he would retrain as a teacher. So he was in training and I didn't have a job. So it was a really, and neither of us comes from backgrounds where there were people in the background who could support us. So it was down to us. But it was the right thing to do.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit because, well, in the spirit of your great dramatic sense there, which was to suggest that the idea had come the next day rather than a few weeks later. And we can fast forward a little bit now because you wrote a few books before Labyrinth, which was your big, huge best-selling success. But of course, before the book came out, you had to write it. And
well, in those days, yes. Who knows in the future?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just going to press button.
But it's interesting, when you were talking about your parents earlier, you used a French phrase. And you clearly have this connection with France and Carcassonne in particular. But I think you have spoken in the past about where Labyrinth came from, this sense of being in that place and being very quite sensitive to the environment and knowing that there was a story there to tell. But can you tell me a little bit more about that sense? Because it's really interesting.
Well, we bought a tiny little house in the shadow of the medieval city walls of Carcassonne in November 1989. Well, we bought it a couple of months earlier. And I knew nothing about Carcassonne. None of us did. My wonderful mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, who is known to many readers of mine because of my memoir, An Extra Pair of Hands, which is about my life as a carer. And I now am a carer for Granny Rosie, but that's very recent. She's 94 now. I've been a carer for only about 5 of her years. And when she retired, she wanted to buy a little something because she'd never owned a house herself or had a mortgage herself. And she had an affection for France because of my husband, because he had left university and gone to Paris and she'd gone to visit him a lot. And the only reason we're in Carcassonne is that Rosie had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who was an estate agent, who was twinned with an estate agent in a little place called Carcassonne. That's the only reason we were there.
Yeah.
And my husband and my mother-in-law went over when I was pregnant with my daughter and came back at the end of the weekend saying, we bought a house. And I was like, you bought a house without me? I can't believe it. And it was 20,000 francs.
Yeah, yeah.
Tiny little house. And it's still known locally as Madame Noubel's house because she had been born in that house in the late, 19th century and had died in that house.
Yeah.
And it, beaten earth floors, all of this kind of thing. And we went there for the first time in November 1989, and I was pregnant with my daughter. And we got off the train, because there were no flights in those days, and walked through the town. And anyone who knows France will know that there is this thing that happens at 7:01 when the shops shut. It is everybody vanishes. So it's completely deserted. So we walked through this misty, deserted place. And we got to the old bridge, the Pont Vieux, which is over the River Aude that separates the modern town, which is 14th century, from the medieval citadel that sits on the hill on the other side of the river. And I just saw it. And this extraordinary 2 rings of stone, 52 towers and turrets, completely deserted, big floodlights so you could just see the drizzle in the November mist. And it was, as I've said many times before, coup de foudre, and I just fell in love. And more than that, I thought, oh, I belong here. There was this extraordinary sense of homecoming. And I didn't intend to write about it. You know, it was going to be a little house. You know, we lived on in a terraced house on a main road in Deptford that was not swanky at that time. And it was going to be somewhere that we could go and, just spend the holidays and bring our children up and all of that. But the minute I had started to read about the history for the area, I discovered this story of a group of so-called heretical Christians called the Cathars, who had been persecuted, lived and died in that part of France. And everything that I learned just kind of deepened this sense of, I get this. And it's then that the whispering in the landscape started. That's how I think of it. All of my fiction is inspired by that. The idea that here, in this place, at this time, there are people speaking to me. There are stories that I could tell. And I didn't know what that phenomenon was to start with. I just remember very clearly sitting on the sofa one day thinking, that is annoying. I cannot remember what happens next. And then thinking, oh, that's because I'm making this one up. This isn't a film I've seen or a piece of theatre or a book I've read. It's because it's a story that I'm trying to see. And all of those years, living part of the year in Carcassonne, finally going to a place called Montségur, which is a mountain in the Pyrenees, and it was there that the valiant efforts of the Cathars and the independence of the south came to an end in March 1244, after a crusade that had started against the Cathars of the north in 1209. And I'd put off going there, I could see later, because I didn't want there to be no spirit of place. I didn't want to get there and the voices to be silent. And finally we went there in March. I can't actually remember the year. Variously, when I tell the story, the children are 6 and 4, they might have been 7 and 5. I know they were there, and Granny Rosie was there, and my husband was there, and they all stayed down below, and they built a snowman. It was the same time of year. And I walked up to the top of the citadel on my own. And it's not the same building that was there in 1244. It had been destroyed many times and rebuilt many times. But I walked up, and it was misty, and it was freezing cold snow everywhere. And then I just kept walking, and I suddenly was through the cloud cover. And above the cloud cover, the sky was that amazing blue of the Midi. And I got up into the citadel itself. There was nobody else there. It was bitter and stupid to be doing it at all. And France in those days, not so much now, but in those days, they had a very different attitude to health and safety, which was essentially, if you climb up a mountain in the snow, in inappropriate clothing, and you slip on the ice and fall and die, it is your fault. So you shouldn't have done it. So it was beautifully, gloriously dangerous and deserted. And I climbed up to the top of the wall, and I looked out, and the sun was this beautiful white ball in the sky, bright, everything glistening. I could see the Pic de Saint Bartholomew and the Pic de Soulerac, and all around. And I thought two things. Firstly, I thought, what would it have been like to stand on this wall on the 16th of March, 1244, and know that you would never see such beauty again, and look down and see the pyre that had been built for you and your friends and family, and know that in the matter of hours everybody you loved would be dead. And then I had this very clear image of a woman pulling a red cloak around herself. And that was it. And I went back down and rejoined my family and, started to have the idea for the novel. And years later, probably 8, maybe even 10 years later, I was writing that chapter in Labyrinth, where the lead character, Alaïs, is at Montségur on the day the citadel falls. And I typed, and she pulled her red cloak around herself. I thought, it's you. I met you all those years ago on the wall, but I did not know who you were. And that is how fiction works.
It's such a great story. I mean, I know you will have been asked, did you know when you were writing it that it was going to become this big book? And of course, there's no way any writer could ever know that when they're writing something. But Was there something about the book that did feel slightly more significant, maybe, than the books that had come previously? Maybe
Oh,
because
yeah,
that connection?
yes, absolutely. I mean, before, I'd published 4 books before, 2 novels and 2 non-fiction. And I'm proud of all of them. You know, there was a wonderful survey that came out, New Year survey, when everybody's starting to say, this is the year I'm going to write the book I've always wanted to write. You know, about that 78% of people, I think it was, want to write a book, but only 3% finish it.
Right.
You know, so the thing is, it's anybody who finishes a book has done something. It's, you know, it's hard, because you start off in this great enthusiasm, and then it gets harder, and then you're disappointed, and no book that you write will ever be as good as the book you imagine in your head. But the thing was, for me, was that partly because I'd worked in publishing, I was very good at the technical side of things. You know, I know how to edit a book. I was an editor. I know what makes a book work. But it's that indefinable magic, the thing that AI will not be able to replicate. You know, if you were a religious person, you might say the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
You know, if you were Terry Pratchett, you know, you've read The Thief of Time, you know that they take everything apart in a priceless, beautiful masterpiece, a painting, in order to find out how it works. And then they put it back together exactly the same, except something is missing. So for me, I'd written 2 good non-fiction books, 2 novels where I'd sat on my own shoulder editing as I went, and I hadn't discovered my voice as a writer. And of course, the person you are as a writer is not necessarily the person you are as a reader. And I hadn't learned that. So with Labyrinth, what happened was I stopped thinking about how to do it and did it. And if you like, any book that has any kind of integrity comes from the inside out, not the outside in. You know, looking from the outside, saying this is how a book works, will not deliver that thing that makes a book sing. So no, I had no idea it was going to become the success it did, but I knew it was different, because I had to write it. And ever since, every novel I've written, I've had to write. Every non-fiction I've written as well, I've just had to write it. Whereas before, not that it was technical, but it was intellectual rather than emotional, I suppose. So it meant a great deal. And I knew when I was writing it that it mattered to me in a different way. It wasn't a piece of work. And keeping hold of that is what matters when you're a writer, and why you keep writing. And until I run out of those moments when I suddenly think, oh, you know, and it's not about what happens to the book afterwards, it's about what it feels like when you're doing it. That's the difference.
I think it was when Waterstones itself was celebrating its 25th anniversary, they asked booksellers to find out what were the 25 best books ever written. And Labyrinth is on that list.
I know, it was wonderful that it was.
It was clearly really chimed with booksellers at that time. You then, of course, have this sort of whirlwind experience of being an international bestseller. Tell me a little bit about what that's like, to suddenly be thrust into that spotlight. It must be very exciting, but also maybe slightly confusing and slightly daunting?
I think, no, I think I was very well set up for something like that to happen. Not that I was expecting it to happen, but because I know that it's all luck. That was the difference. Not that it didn't turn my head. You know, I was not a giddy girl. I was in my mid-40s. I was living my life. My life wasn't going to change the life that I lived on the day-to-day basis. Did it become different? Absolutely. Was it marvellous and pinch-making? You know, sort of like, is this happening to... Of course. But it's a different thing if it happens when you're 20 and it's your first book and you don't know anything about... You know, of course, you think, well, it's all down to you. But it really isn't. And having been a publisher for many years, and then having been involved in setting up the Women's Prize and seeing publishing in a 360 way, I was in a very different position from most authors. So I knew that, of course, the quality of the book matters. But we all know, you know, everybody in this, the hallowed, Waterstones Piccadilly knows that there are wonderful books that don't get their moment in the sun. And there are truly shockingly mediocre books that become the big thing. And this is what I say to writing students all of the time. The only thing in your control is the text. What happens to it after that is out of your control. And so you've got to learn to preserve your joy of writing and allow yourself to be disappointed if things don't go well, but know that the only cure for that is to get writing the next one. Because again, you might be lucky again, or you might not. And so that, I knew all of those things. And the beginning of Labyrinth publication couldn't have gone worse. So Labyrinth hardback, and we'd been building up to this, and there was a buzz around it, and I was trying not to get seduced by that, but there was a buzz around it. And then it published on the 7th of July 2005. And that was the day that all the bombs went off in London. So I got off the train. I was coming to my publishers to be taken for lunch and to just do all of that stuff. And people, it's really hard to imagine going back 20 years how people did have mobile phones, but we were not in what has been called techno-feudalism at that stage. We were not all glued to the phones. There wasn't 24-hour news. It wasn't quick in that sort of way. And so I wasn't on my phone. I was reading a book on the train. And then I started to walk through London. And I did notice, I did think there's a lot of people on the streets. But I always walk. I always factor in enough time to walk rather than use the tube. So I didn't really think anything more about it. Arrived at my publisher's office and they were, what the hell are you doing here? And it was like, it's my publication day. and they were like, come with us into the cellar.
Yeah.
Or the basement. Because of course nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew the scale of things. And it was a big glass building and everybody who was in an office was in the basement. And it was the most peculiar experience. And of course, everything to do with my novel that I'd been working on for 10 years being published was utterly irrelevant in the face of what London was facing that day and what people faced that day. And finally I got home very late. They managed to find a car and I was sent home to Sussex in a car. And that was that. So it was the most peculiar thing. But then what happened was booksellers. Booksellers were hand selling. And what that means is that when somebody went into a bookshop and they were saying, I don't know what to read, I'm stuck, they were saying, have you tried this? So it was a very odd experience that it suddenly, a week and a half after publication, went into the hardback chart at number 10. And then next week it was number 8. And it did everything that is never seen in publishing.
Right.
It went in slowly, it gently crept its way up, it hit number 1, and then gently went down again. But when it went in at number 10, my husband laminated the Sunday Times bestseller list because that felt like the biggest achievement of my life. And it never occurred to me it would be better than that. And that's the chart that is still hanging in the house.
Oh, that's so great.
The number 10 in hardback. And then, as you say, Richard and Judy, January 2006. You don't know what they're going to say. You have gone and done a film with them. And it was freezing cold and we were filming in Carcassonne. And all I could think about when the film started was, why did nobody tell me my nose was bright red? Because it was really bright red, you know. We were wandering around. And that was wonderful. And it was one of the most nerve-wracking things that's ever happened. Sitting in our house in Bognor Regis, which is where we lived at the time, with my children either side, holding hands, to watch the episode, beginning of January 2006, when you have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then they showed the film. And I do think this is part of its success. Came out of the film, and Richard Madeley said, oh, she seems like a nice lady. I was like, never mind the book. But I think the two things that made a difference. One was coming after Dan Brown. It looked like that would be a disaster, but actually people were interested in that kind of more esoteric Grail legend story. And obviously mine is a little bit more rooted in history, in fact. So that was very helpful, actually. The other one was that Richard, as opposed to Judy, led the conversation. Because, I say this with my Women's Prize hat on, we know that women read books by women and men. And sadly, men often feel that books by women are not for them. That hasn't really changed the dial. The Women's Prize has helped change it, other things have helped change it. So therefore, having a man say, I love this book, that put it in a place that is unusual for a novel written by a woman with female lead characters. And the day after it had been on Richard and Judy, it sold 57,000 copies.
Wow, that's incredible.
Which is, peanuts
Yeah.
to Richard Osman, first week sale. But then it was a really significant thing.
Yeah.
And then it stayed in the chart. It was number one for the next 7 months, I think.
All of this fame and attention means, of course, that you were sort of pursued, I'm sure, wherever you went. But you told me a story. You did tell me a story about when you were in America, which is to do with the thing that you've probably had to deal with for much of your life, which is, my name's Kate Mosse, but not that Kate Mosse.
Yes.
But when you went to America as part of the publicity for that book, I believe, is when there was a particular incident where you caused quite a kerfuffle.
Yeah, it did. It was fantastic. I mean, it comes back to you becoming an overnight success in your mid-40s.
Yeah.
And therefore you are you, really, by that stage. And so all of these things were just funny, and they were great. So I am not a supermodel, as we know. My name is not spelt the same. I am older. I have been around longer, obviously. I did actually once hear my mother-in-law. It's hilarious. I was in the garden and she was on the other side on the road behind the fence, which is quite a high fence. And I did hear my mother-in-law say to somebody, said, no, she's a drab little thing, really. You wouldn't think she was famous. It's like, thank you very much. So I spent a lot of time with people going, their faces falling, taxi driver arrives, Kate Mosse, like, oh. And then, of course, they are always adorable, go out of their way to try to be, they go, well, you're much better looking, it's fine. Not, and that's okay. That's not what I'm, aspiring to. But my agent in America at the time was a man called George Lucas, who is also not that George Lucas. And somewhere along the line, we were going to the very famous restaurant in Sex and the City, where there's a big Buddha. I don't know what the restaurant's called because I had not ever seen Sex and the City, but I am told reliably this is true. And someone in his office had rung up and made the booking. I don't quite know how it happened for George Lucas and Kate Mosse. Now, those two together, it's plausible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's plausible somehow. And there's obviously was somebody there who was making a side hustle by telling the paparazzi when famous people were in. So we arrive at this restaurant and it's cameras everywhere. We think, we say in our very English way, somebody exciting's in, we say as we go in. We go in, give our names. I didn't notice a blanching, but if I was writing the scene, I would have noticed the maitre d' kind of going white at this stage. And we are shown to a ludicrously brilliant table right in the middle of the restaurant, right in the most, the famous table. Yeah. And we go, this is great. And I go, well done, George, you've done absolutely fantastically. And we just start, doing this. And then we notice there is kerfuffling going on outside, and a waiter has gone outside. And we start to notice them all packing up their cameras and putting their lenses away. And then we realise. And it's great.
We want to come now to the Women's Prize, and I hadn't realised, I suppose, that the inception of that and Labyrinth were so close together actually in time. But it was slightly inspired by this Booker shortlist that contained no female authors on it, and has completely transformed, I think, the prize-giving landscape. Yeah. Was it just simply that this is absurd, that most books are written by and read by women, and yet the prizes go to the men effectively? That is it as simple as that?
Yes and no. The inspiration, as it were, was that there was a Booker Prize shortlist with no women on it. But it's really important to say that the Booker is a fantastic prize. It's not them and us. We're not at loggerheads. And when I wanted to set up the prize, I went to, the Booker people and said, talk to me, tell me about all of these things. We all did. It was not, therefore, the books that were on the shortlist at that first instance. It was the fact that nobody noticed. And a lot of us said, can you just imagine? Can you imagine if they put out a list of 6 women? Everybody, every media outlet, every journalist would have cried foul. They would have said, this is political, this is deliberate, this is anti-male. All you need to do often to see the reality of things is to flip them on their heads. But nobody noticed. And then when the list was put out, people went, there's no women on it. And they were like, oh, that's a surprise. So out of that, a group of us just said, let's just look into this, because this seems a bit odd. And it was a year where there was a Margaret Atwood, there was an Angela Carter, you know, there were some fantastic, obvious book of books, if you like, there. And we decided that we would do some research. That was the thing. Out of that meeting came the idea that maybe we needed to look into this a little more, see who was getting shortlisted for prizes, how they worked. And it was precisely because I had just left my job in publishing and was newly pregnant and was newly writing. I had time. And so that was one of the reasons that I became the person leading this forward, because everybody else had a full-time job, you know. And so I was doing that, and we did a lot of research. It was very ad hoc, but it was really very, very clear that at that stage, 60% of novels published in the UK were authored by women. So there wasn't a problem about women getting to market, or at least certain women getting to market. 75% of novels bought, so far as we could tell, were bought by women. But fewer than 9% of books, novels, ever shortlisted for literary prizes were by women. So the issue wasn't women being published, it was women's work being respected and seen as literature, if you like. And it came back to the old idea, really, that literature is neutral. Literature with a capital L is neutral, but when you decode that, it actually meant the writing of white men. And we were absolutely clear all along that therefore we would set up a prize that would celebrate and amplify and honour women's voices, women writing fiction in English from all over the world. It would be global. It's never been, nothing in all of my life has ever been about taking gorgeous, brilliant, gifted, fantastic men out. It's always been about adding the women in where they deserve to be, and in terms of the writing of history, where they always have been. But when we announced the prize, there was an absolute determination. You know, we are living in times of historic misinformation now.
Yeah.
But there has always been an element of that. And there was a determination from the media to paint it as an anti-male thing.
Yeah.
And it was very deliberate, the campaign against the prize. And it formed, you know, one was if women were any good, they'd win the real prizes. And all you can do is say, look at the data. Let's just look at the data. And the other one was, this is an anti-male thing. And you'd say, no, it isn't. This is amazing books written by women for male and female readers. Readers are missing out because prizes was one of the most important ways. So what I learnt very early on in that, I was quite naive when it all started. You know, when I announced it, I've told this story before, but when we'd finally got the funding and it was going to happen, it was 1996, it was going to be the first year, and I stood up at the ICA in London thrilled, because a private company was going to give what in the end was millions and millions to books. How could anybody who liked reading or who was a writer not think that was great?
Yeah.
Didn't occur to me that people were going to go. So I gave this impassioned speech about this, and I thought, you know, that it would be like a Bruegel painting, that everybody would be throwing their hats in the air. Unfortunately, that was not how it played out. I finished my speech, I explained how the prize was going to work. It was all positive, the way that I presented. I'm a campaigner who campaigns positively, not critically. I said, anybody got any questions? An arm went up at the back of the room, a tweedy arm. I didn't know the journalist at that stage, so I didn't know he was from the Daily Express. And I said, gentleman at the back, he said, are you a lesbian?
Right.
And that was the first question asked on record about the Women's Prize.
Yeah.
And of course my answer was, no, are you? Everybody laughed, but it set a tone.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting 5-6 months for me. I don't know how I would have coped in these days of social media, because in those days, and people did this, you know, some man got my home number and rang up and told my husband he should be ashamed of me for letting me say these things. You know, now what women have to put up on social media is quite appalling.
Yeah.
But then it was much harder. You know, people had to write nasty notes.
Yeah.
You know, sort of, or send an email by the publisher. But the thing was, it comes back to everything in life, doesn't it? Good suffragette motto: deeds not words. If you don't think something's right, you've got a choice. You can whinge about it, which is actually what most of social media is, doing nothing. Or you can do something. And nothing is perfect. But doing something to change the dial is better than doing nothing, if you think there's something. And I can look back now as we come to the 30th and think, as you said, actually, it's changed things. The Women's Prize has changed things. It's meant that every year there is a debate about gender and sex and writing and reading and who gets to choose. Every year it puts astonishing novels in the hands of readers who will love them. It's changed reading lists at universities and schools. It's made all of the debate about who writes what and who is reading what more live. We don't have to agree with each other. The bedrock of healthy society is people respecting and admiring one another, admiring their work, admiring their point, but disagreeing. Disagreement is healthy. Attack, destroying the other person's point of view, not allowing them to speak, is the road to hell. We know, if we know our history, we know where that ends up, and we are in those times at the moment. So I still believe that books change the world. I still believe that the majority of people want to listen as well as talk. They want to enjoy difference. They want to be bedazzled and beguiled and enchanted by the worlds that an amazing book can open up for them. That sense of there being something that is celebratory. So, you know, I will continue to support the Women's Prize and the right of every person who wants to read or write to be allowed to do that until my dying breath.
The running of a prize like that would be job enough for most people. But you have also, of course, continued to write fiction, non-fiction, plays throughout this time. And then on top of that, as you mentioned earlier, you have also been a carer for your dad, your mum, and now your mother-in-law. And you've written about that as well. But this is something that continues to this day as well. And I just sort of wondered how on earth you managed to do all of those things. And I suppose particularly the benefits that have come from having had that relationship later in life with your parents and now your mother-in-law.
Yeah, I'll tell you what's really interesting, because it's the 20th anniversary of Labyrinth and I'm about to go on a 6-week theatre tour celebrating the book, and you know, theatres up and down the UK, which will be challenging but fabulous fun. I have reread it for the first time, you know, in many years, because you know, you are always, it's nerve-wracking to go back in, you know. And what I can see about Labyrinth is, of course, it's about a particular period of history. It's about the Cathars themselves and their beliefs. It's about the, you know, it's a love letter to Carcassonne and Toulouse. But in the end, the Grail story that I'm telling is about love. It's about how the people that we love live in us and continue to live in us, and that actually is the Grail. It is the bearing witness, generation after generations, the stories that are passed down. And of course that, with all of my work, you know, the Joubert Family Chronicles at the moment, is the theme that goes through it, that the people that we care about never really die if we carry them with us. And it was very odd rereading some of the scenes in Labyrinth where I had written about the death of parents, which I had never experienced.
Yeah.
The way in which people remain with you long after they've gone, which I had never experienced. And realising that those scenes were true, that I hadn't been through it myself, but because I was very close to my parents and had seen them go through it, I had actually absorbed those kind of things. And so I think it's a great privilege if you are loved unconditionally, which I was, and you are close to your family, as I was. It's a privilege to care for people at the end of their lives. For many people, the caring challenge is much greater because they are often caring for people they don't even know very well, or for people who have not cared for them. So I'm very, very lucky. All three of my experiences have been a giving back, only fair giving back of the things that have been done for me. And I think the one thing that you do learn when you're a carer, and anybody who is listening to this who is a carer will know, that time has a different kind of meaning, because we are all encouraged to do things fast, that it's all about the end result. But of course, that isn't what it's like. When you're caring for somebody, it's not simply about getting something done. It's about dignity, and it's about somebody not losing all of their agency, if you like. So I've always been quite a patient person, oddly, but I learnt patience in particular. And also that, you know, I like a chat, but listening is very important as well. Listening is very important as well. And that loss is natural. Grief is natural. That all those, you know, the Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages, they happen. You know, you will feel all of those things. And that you will, you know, the most important thing any of us can do for each other is not live with regret. So if your parents are still around, talk to them now. If your siblings are around, talk to them now. The weirdest thing when I was writing my non-fiction book, my feminist history book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, was thinking, God, I wish I could talk to my dad about his granny, because I was writing about her, my great-grandmother. But of course, there never was the time somehow for that. So finding the time to have those slow conversations, those conversations that are not about the everyday, that is the one lesson that you can learn from being a carer. You know, just find time for those bigger conversations.
A fantastic note on which to end, Kate. Happy anniversaries.
Thank you.
I should say, but thank you for giving me some time to talk to you about both of those things, and indeed the caring aspect too, which is fantastic.
It is a pleasure. Thank you.